400 years ago, the American experiment was on the brink of total collapse. The settlers we now call the Pilgrims, famous in our national story for their faith and courage, were starving. Their dream of building a new world, a beacon of religious freedom, was turning into a nightmare of hunger and disease on the shores of a vast, unforgiving continent. They weren't just fighting the weather, they were fighting an idea. It turns out they were repeating the exact same mistakes that doomed earlier English settlers and brought the Jamestown colony to the edge of cannibalism. Their entire settlement in Plymouth was about to be wiped off the map, not by an enemy, but by a broken system they had created. This is the story of how they stared into the abyss and what they had to change to pull themselves back. It's a story about the catastrophic failure of a system and the discovery of an idea that would go on to define the very core of the American identity. To understand the knife's edge the Pilgrims were on, we have to go back 13 years before they even arrived, to 1607. On the swampy banks of a Virginia river, another group of Englishmen established the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown. But their story isn't one of triumph, it's a horrifying cautionary tale, a ghost of failure that haunted every attempt to tame the new world that followed. Jamestown's mission, paid for by the Virginia Company in London, wasn't about building a new society, it was about making money. The investors and colonists were after gold, a mythical passage to Asia, and any other valuables they could pull from the land. The first wave of settlers was tragically wrong for the job. Many of them were gentlemen, men of privilege who weren't used to manual labor and had none of the skills needed to survive in a wilderness. They thought they'd find gold, trade for food, and get rich. They didn't expect to have to build a colony with their own two hands. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The settlers were hit with diseases from the slimy, salty river water they drank. Their relationship with the native Powhatan people was filled with tension and violence, but the most terrifying chapter came during the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period known today by a chillingly direct name, the Starving Time. After the colony's tough but effective leader, Captain John Smith, was forced to return to England, the Powhatan laid siege to the fort. Trade stopped. Hunting parties were attacked. Trapped inside their wooden walls, the colonists of Jamestown began to die in droves. As food ran out, they ate their animals, first horses, then dogs and cats. Soon they were eating rats, mice, and even the leather from their shoes. Then the desperation descended into the ultimate taboo. George Percy, the colony's president that winter, wrote of a world of miseries, and he wasn't exaggerating. Archaeologists have since confirmed his horrifying accounts of cannibalism. The remains of a young girl, nicknamed Jane by researchers, show clear butchery marks, proof that her body was dismembered and eaten by the starving survivors. By the spring of 1610, when supply ships finally arrived, they found a horror scene. Of the roughly 500 colonists who had been there in the fall, fewer than 61 were left. The survivors were skeletons, half mad with hunger. The colony was in ruins, and the immediate decision was made to abandon it completely. Only the last-second arrival of a new governor with fresh supplies stopped Jamestown from becoming another lost colony. This collapse wasn't just bad luck. It was a failure of the system. The company's top-down corporate structure was a mess. But crucially, their internal economy, where all food was collected into a common store and handed out by the leadership, killed individual effort. Why work hard when you get the same reward as the guy who does nothing? It was a question that led to laziness and resentment. Jamestown's nightmare came after an even stranger failure, the Roanoke colony. In 1587, a settlement was established on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. When its governor returned from a supply trip 3 years later, he found the colony totally empty. The only clue was the word Croatoan, carved into a post. The 115 men, women, and children had vanished, likely absorbed by local tribes or killed by a severe drought. These ghosts of Roanoke and Jamestown proved that while you could cross the Atlantic, the New World could easily kill you. This was the terrifying backdrop as another small group of English idealists gambled their lives on a different vision for America. The people we call the Pilgrims were a group of religious dissenters known as separatists. They believed the Church of England was hopelessly corrupt and that their only choice was to separate from it completely. In 17th century England, this was a dangerous idea. Facing persecution, they first fled to the more tolerant city of Leiden, Holland in 1609. But Holland, while safe, wasn't home. After a decade, their children were becoming Dutch, losing their English identity. So they dreamed of a new place where they could build a society from scratch based on their English roots but centered on their own faith. They set their sights on America. As their future governor, William Bradford, wrote, their goal was to lay a foundation for advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. To fund this massive journey, they partnered with a group of English investors called the Merchant Adventurers. These men weren't driven by faith, they were driven by profit. They saw the Pilgrims as a workforce that could set up a trading post to generate money from fishing, lumber, and the fur trade. This alliance between the faithful and the financiers led to a contract that would become the source of the Pilgrims' greatest test. It was a joint stock company, binding the colonists and investors for 7 years. The terms were brutal. For those 7 years, everything was to be held in common. All land, all houses, all profits, everything went into a common stock. From this stock, every member of the colony would get an equal share of food and supplies. There would be no private property, no individual businesses. At the end of 7 years, everything would be sold off and divided equally between the investors and the colonists. To the investors, this made sense. It ensured all labor went toward repaying their investment. But to the Pilgrims, it was a bitter pill. They argued for at least 2 days a week to work for their own families. But the adventurers refused. With no other options, the Pilgrims agreed. They had their passage to the New World, but they had just signed up for an economic system almost identical to the one that had encouraged laziness and starvation in Jamestown. They had set a trap for themselves. In the late summer of 1620, the Mayflower set out on the furious Atlantic. The voyage was a grueling 66-day nightmare. They were crammed into dark, damp spaces between decks, constantly battered by storms. Sickness was everywhere. They were supposed to land near the Hudson River, but the storms blew them far off course. On November 11th, 1620, they dropped anchor near Cape Cod, Massachusetts. They were hundreds of miles north of their destination, and more importantly, outside the legal jurisdiction of their patent. In the eyes of English law, they were squatters with no legal right to be there. This created an immediate crisis. The passengers weren't all Pilgrims. The other group, who they called the strangers, were craftsmen and soldiers recruited by the investors. When they realized they were outside the official patent, some of these strangers made mutinous speeches, claiming that none had power to command them. Anarchy was brewing before anyone even stepped on land. The Pilgrim leaders, like William Bradford, knew they had to act fast. Their solution was one of the most pivotal moments in American history. They drafted a short, simple document they called an agreement. History would know it as the Mayflower Compact. For its time, it was a radical document. It wasn't a constitution, but a social contract. The 41 men who signed it, both Pilgrims and strangers, agreed to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. They pledged to create just and equal laws for the general good of the colony, and they all promised to obey them. With those simple words, they did something revolutionary. Instead of a government imposed by a king or a company, they created one by the consent of the governed. While Jamestown was ruled by a council appointed by a distant corporation, Plymouth would be ruled by the people themselves. The Mayflower Compact had saved the colony from political collapse before it even started, but it couldn't save them from the flawed economic system that still bound them. After signing the compact, the Pilgrims finally chose a spot for their settlement in December 1620, a harbor they named Plymouth. The site seemed perfect. It had a defensible hill, fresh water, and fields that were already cleared. They didn't know they were building on the ruins of a Wampanoag village named Patuxet, whose entire population had been wiped out by a plague just a few years earlier. As they started building in the dead of winter, a general sickness swept through the colonists. Crowded together on the ship and in makeshift shelters, they were defenseless against scurvy and pneumonia. The toll was staggering. At times, only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for all the sick and dying. Of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower, nearly half were dead by the end of that first brutal winter. It was a death rate that rivaled Jamestown's starving time. Just as the colony was on the verge of disappearing, a miracle walked out of the woods. In March of 1621, a Native American man strode into their village and shocked them by saying hello in broken English. His name was Samoset. He later returned with another man, Tisquantum, or Squanto, the last surviving member of the Patuxet tribe. Squanto's life story is unbelievable. He wasn't just a man of the forest. He had been kidnapped years earlier, taken to Spain to be sold as a slave, rescued by friars, and had even lived in London, where he learned English. He finally managed to get a ride back to his homeland, only to find his entire village gone, erased by disease. This man, who had every reason to hate Europeans, became the Pilgrims' savior. He served as their interpreter and helped them forge a peace treaty with the most powerful chief in the region, Massasoit of the Wampanoag. This alliance was maybe the single most important difference between Plymouth and Jamestown. While Jamestown fought a bloody war, the Pilgrims secured a peace that lasted 50 years. And Squanto did more than just talk. He taught the Pilgrims how to survive. He showed them how to plant corn, fertilizing the soil with fish. He taught them where to fish and hunt. As Governor Bradford wrote, he was a special instrument sent of God for their good. Thanks to Squanto and the Wampanoag, the harvest of 1621 was a success. They had enough food. They celebrated with a 3-day feast, inviting Massasoit and 90 of his men. This event, a symbol of survival and cooperation, became the foundation for our modern Thanksgiving holiday. It seemed like the colony had finally turned a corner, and yet the greatest threat to their existence was still simmering just beneath the surface. That famous 1621 feast wasn't the start of happy times, it was a short break. For the next 2 years, the Plymouth colony was constantly on the edge of famine. Soon after that first harvest, a ship arrived with 35 new colonists to feed, but brought almost no food. The small surplus was gone instantly. The next harvests were terrible. So, what was going wrong? The answer wasn't the soil or the weather, it was the system. The communal economic model forced on them by their contract was a disaster. Governor William Bradford, in his famous History of Plymouth Plantation, gives a detailed takedown of why it failed. He saw the problem wasn't the people, but the idea. Bradford wrote that the communal system bred much confusion and discontent. The heart of the problem was a total disconnect between how hard you worked and what you got. He noted that the young men that were most able and fit for labor did repine or complain that they had to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man who worked all day got the same amount of food as the man who was lazy or pretended to be sick. Bradford said they called this an injustice. This feeling spread through the whole community. Respected older men felt it was an insult to be treated the same as younger, less experienced men. The women had to cook and clean for everyone, which Bradford said they saw as a kind of slavery, complaining they had to wash clothes for men who weren't their husbands. The result was predictable. Motivation collapsed. When there's no personal reason to be productive, people won't be. People did the bare minimum. The fields weren't cared for. The spirit the system was supposed to create was replaced with suspicion and resentment. It was driving the colony into the ground. By the spring of 1623, after 2 years of this slow motion disaster, the colony was again facing a severe famine. They were out of food, with the planting season right around the corner. Bradford knew that if they didn't change course, Plymouth wouldn't survive another year. Something had to give. In the desperate spring of 1623, with starvation breathing down their necks, the leaders of Plymouth gathered to face their failure. As Bradford wrote, they began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could and obtain a better crop. After a lot of debate, they made a decision that was both practical and radical. They decided to ditch the common course and condition. Legally, they couldn't do this. It was a direct violation of their contract with the investors in London, but they chose survival over the contract. Bradford and the other leaders decided that they should set corn, every man for his own particular, and in that regard, trust to themselves. The change was put into place immediately. The leadership assigned a parcel of land to each family. It wasn't permanent ownership yet, but for the first time, each family was responsible for planting, tending, and harvesting its own food on its own plot of land. They would work for themselves, and they would get to keep what they grew. The psychological impact was instant and incredible. This had very good success, Bradford wrote, for it made all hands very industrious. Suddenly, the fields were buzzing with activity. The same people who had been lazy and resentful were now filled with energy. Bradford even noted that the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability. The young men who had complained about working for others now worked hard to provide for their own future families. This wasn't just about food, it was about dignity and incentive. By connecting work with reward, the new system unleashed the power of personal responsibility and private interest. The Pilgrims had stumbled upon a fundamental principle of economics. Ownership and the chance for personal gain are the most powerful engines of productivity. Looking back on it years later, Bradford wrote that the idea that taking away private property to create a happy and flourishing state was just an emptiness. His real-world experiment in Plymouth had proven that even among good and honest men, such a system only created confusion and discontent. The decision they made in the spring of 1623 was the turning point. It was the moment they saved themselves by embracing an idea that would become uniquely American. The results of the 1623 harvest were spectacular. For the first time in 3 years, the colonists had more than enough food. The famine was over. The colony was finally self sufficient. Bradford reported that by planting corn for themselves, they had managed with a great deal of patience to overcome famine. They had so much extra corn that it became a form of money used to trade for other goods. A small internal market was born. The colony was saved. This new prosperity secured Plymouth's future. By 1627, the colonists felt confident enough to buy out their London investors for £1,800, finally freeing themselves from the contract that had nearly killed them. The land that had been assigned for temporary use was converted into permanent, privately owned plots. The colony flourished, paving the way for the massive wave of Puritan migration that would arrive a decade later. The Pilgrims' journey is a powerful lesson. They weren't saved by faith alone, or by that one nice dinner with their Native American neighbors. They were saved because they were willing to learn from a catastrophic mistake and abandon a failing idea when they saw the hard evidence. They faced the same abyss that nearly swallowed Jamestown, an abyss created by a system that crushed individual incentive, and they made a different choice. In that desperate decision in 1623 to give each family its own plot of land, the Pilgrims laid down one of the first cornerstones of the American identity. The principles they discovered through bitter experience, the power of private property, individual responsibility, and free enterprise, would become deeply woven into the nation's DNA. 400 years ago, a small group of settlers learned that the system you live under is a matter of life and death. They learned that no amount of shared belief can overcome the flaws of a system that runs against human nature. By rejecting the failed system that was leading them to ruin, they not only saved themselves, but also conducted the first true American experiment in freedom. The story of the Pilgrims is so much more than the simple myth of the first Thanksgiving. It's a gritty, desperate story of survival. It shows us that America's success was never guaranteed. It was earned in the face of failure. They were nearly wiped out, not by an enemy or a storm, but by a bad idea. A system that promised a utopia, but delivered only starvation. Their ultimate triumph came from a courageous, practical decision to change course and embrace a system that empowered individuals and families. In doing so, they discovered a fundamental truth about what makes a society flourish, a truth that would shape the United States for centuries to come. If you found this piece of hidden history fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And let us know what you think in the comments. Was the Pilgrims' decision in 1623 the first American rejection of socialism, or was it simply a practical choice for survival? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching.